Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 27 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have won 6-5 in overtime. And it was just over a month ago in which we as fans were wondering if the Sharks could even sustain a 1 goal per game average at this point. You know, it's like said half jokingly, but half seriously, just based on how much of a struggle it was to put the puck in the net in the early parts of the season. And now suddenly, just over the last 4 games on this road trip, the Sharks have scored 22 goals, which is just an absurdly high amount. Now, obviously, those 22 goals scored does come with 18 goals against, which for the coaching staff is perhaps not super preferable, but us as fans who want to see high-scoring games, bring it on. Bring on more of these 6-5, 5-4 style of victories or losses even for the San Jose Sharks. And this also marks a second straight game in which the Sharks come back from a 3+ goal deficit to win it in overtime. The first time in franchise history that this has happened in 2 consecutive games. And as we jump into this one, the first period, it actually was scoreless in a 6-5 game, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was essentially even between these two teams. In fact, it was the Sharks who were quite dominant through the first 20 minutes. They doubled up in terms of chances and opportunities over the Detroit Red Wings, and the Red Wings were quite lucky to find themselves tied at 0 at the end of the first period. The Sharks obviously wanted a better start after their weak start against the Islanders a couple of days ago, and they got exactly that, even if they didn't end up getting rewarded for their strong early play. That's when the second period rolled around, and after a few minutes where the Sharks were still looking pretty good, Detroit managed to get the first goal of the game to make it 1-0, and this is where things really opened up. A few minutes later, the Red Wings would score a goal to make it 2-0, then 3-0, and then 4-0, all within the span of just 49 seconds, and it felt very reminiscent to some of those early season games that the Sharks have played, where they give up 1 goal, suddenly the mental falls apart, and they just give up goal after goal after goal, and ends up being like a 10-1 loss for the team. But they rallied, and you weren't necessarily expecting it, especially since after the 4th goal, it was Marc-Edouard Vlasic who would actually get called for an unsportsmanlike penalty, putting the Red Wings on the power play, an opportunity for them to just make it 5-0 at that point. But the Sharks rallied back. And it is said at this point in the National Hockey League, yes, the game of hockey can be very luck-based at times with bounces, but the thing that is said is that you have to be good to be lucky. And the Sharks were rewarded with their previous good play through the first 30 minutes of this game with some nice lucky bounces on the Sharks' penalty kill. And that allows Hertl to get the shorthanded goal, and then Zetterlund soon after to get a second shorthanded goal to cut the lead in half. And then emerging from the penalty box, Vlasic makes a very nice pass and play to Nico Sturm, who makes it 4-3, and suddenly the Sharks' 4-goal deficit is turned into just a 1-goal deficit over the span of now about 2 minutes. Combined, these two teams scored 6 goals in 3 minutes and 1 second, which is close to an NHL record, an absolutely insane stretch of play. Had you stepped away from your television to like go walk your dogs or go make dinner or just head to the bathroom and you came back, you'd be wondering what exactly happened because the score would have changed so significantly. And then on top of that, the second period was not finished with its surprises, as in the last 20 or so seconds of it, Nico Sturm would score his second of the game, the second of the season for himself, to tie the game up at 4. In the third period, the scoring would indeed slow down, and it would be the Red Wings who would take the lead back once more, coming from Dylan Larkin to make it 5-4. But the Sharks, for a second straight game, would pull the goaltender, and for a second straight game, it would be Tomas Hertl coming up as the hero for the team to get the game-tying goal. They didn't have exactly the same type of pressure in the 6-on-5 situation as they did against the Islanders a couple of days ago, but it only takes one shot, and one shot was all they needed to get it tied up. And unlike in the previous game where the Sharks needed all of overtime almost to get the game winner from Eklund about 5 seconds left in it, it is instead Granlund who scores about 20 or so seconds into this one to secure the victory for the San Jose Sharks. And once more, like I mentioned in the Islanders review, yes indeed, you want the Sharks to be losing games because you want them to get the best possible pick in the draft lottery, yada yada yada. but at the same time, getting treated to a game in which the Sharks fall behind by 4 goals is pretty disappointing, but then roar back with 4 more goals right at the end of the second period to tie up the game, then get the game-tying goal in an empty net situation with the overtime winner. It all is still making for some very exciting, some very fun hockey, and it should be remembered even with these 2 points in the standings, the Sharks still find themselves right near the bottom of the standings, and it will take a lot more of games like this for the Sharks to eventually claw themselves out of the cellar. So even if they don't end up as dead last place, maybe that will indeed end up going to Chicago. The Sharks should very well, unless some craziness happens, still finish pretty low, and so you have to enjoy these nice games when they do come. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Eklund, Hertl, and Barabanov, and the person who I want to talk about first is William Eklund. I mentioned how in the Islanders game he did pick up 3 points, which was very nice to see, but in terms of actual even strength play, he wasn't necessarily outstanding offensively, but those 3 points absolutely gave him a ton of confidence heading into this game tonight, as for the first 30 minutes of this game, when the game was still relatively scoreless, Eklund was by far the Sharks' best forward. Just in the first period, Eklund probably could have had 2 or 3 goals himself, and on top of that, 2 or 3 primary assists himself as well. He was just all over the ice. He was making plays happen. It was exceptionally impressive, and if he just had slight more finish, we could be talking about like a William Eklund hat trick for the first time in his career. So outstanding game for Eklund, perhaps one of his best of the entire season and technically of his entire career thus far. When it comes to his other 2 line mates, also pretty good. Barabanov continuing to get up to speed, still not quite at the level where I'm really happy with him on this top line, but pretty good game, I would say. And Tomas Hertl, while not as fantastic as he was in the previous one against the New York Islanders, still a very good game for Hertl, which made up a strong first line for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the second line here, we have Zetterlund, Granlund, and Duclair, and Granlund continues to just improve more and more for the San Jose Sharks. He has 3 points here tonight, including the overtime game winner. That gives him a grand total of, I believe, 16 points on the season, which is very impressive for a player who actually missed a decent chunk of time back at the beginning of the season, and then even when returning from injury was still quite bad. A large chunk of these points for Granlund have been picked up over the last dozen or so games, and so it has been quite nice to see his journey from being an ineffective, if not liability for the Sharks, to now being one of their better players on the ice. When it comes to his 2 line mates, Duclair, I don't think necessarily got to shine super brightly in this game, but I do think Zetterlund on the other wing was pretty good, and so it made up a second line that was nice but not outstanding in this one. But Granlund, I would say, really stood out in a positive light to make it so that this second line kind of got carried a bit by him. When it comes to the third line, this was a bit of a tale of 2 games for the third line, because while I thought this line excelled offensively, from a defensive standpoint, they really struggled, and that really isn't exemplified more than by the performance of Justin Bailey here tonight. I mentioned how in the previous review, Justin Bailey, after his debut performance against the Washington Capitals, I believe, where he was quite good, he hasn't really looked all that apparent since then. Here tonight, extremely up and down. From an offensive standpoint, he was making some great plays. He drew a penalty early on in this game off of some really strong forechecking. He was taking pucks away off of just pressuring players in the offensive zone. He had a very nice pass that led to the Nico Sturm goal that tied this game up at 4 near the end of the second period. But in the defensive zone, Bailey really struggled. Obviously, the major one was his terrible giveaway to Patrick Kane, who ends up hitting the post on that situation. Almost just went right into the his own net, essentially, with that terrible play, and just generally getting turned around a lot defensively. So Bailey, the praise does need to be levied towards him for those nice offensive plays, but you also have to be more responsible in your own end. When it comes to Kevin Labanc, I thought very similar style of game. From an offensive standpoint, nice little early pass that led to the Nico Sturm goal as well. Generally playing a solid game in the offensive zone, had some issues defensively, and the same will go go for Nico Sturm, who was at the very least nice to see him get his first 2 goals of the season. Back in my grading video, I mentioned how Nico Sturm had been good enough up to that point, but I was hoping to see an actual level offensively from him, especially considering last season he put up a good 15 plus goals, and maybe these 2 goals are the start of something. When it comes to the fourth line, we have Zadina centering it again with Hoffman and McDonald, and this was a pretty important game, I guess, for Zadina. He returns to Detroit for the first time since leaving them this offseason, sort of mutually parting ways, and so this was an opportunity for him to show Detroit what they've lost out on, and while he didn't actually contribute on the score sheet, I thought Zadina actually had a good amount of jump here tonight, making some decent plays happen, nothing super spectacular, nothing outstanding. He didn't come within inches like you would say for a player like William Eklund early on in this game, but I thought he was perhaps the Sharks' best forward on the fourth line at the very least. He wasn't necessarily given a ton of help, so it was a good game for Zadina. When it comes to the 2 wingers, Jacob McDonald did pretty much nothing in this game for the second straight one here, so again, he's my candidate to be dropped out of the lineup when a Sharks player becomes healthy to replace him. And then when it comes on the other side, we have Mike Hoffman, who I thought was at least a bit better than McDonald, slightly more noticeable, but clearly a step behind Zadina, which is perhaps why this fourth line, even with Zadina having that extra step, didn't actually generate much of anything. When it comes to the defensive pairings, no changes here either from game to game. So the top pairing is Ferraro and Burrows. Ferraro, as per usual, had a very up and down game for sure. You'd look at him, he's so often in the defensive zone because the Sharks very heavily rely on Mario Ferraro in the defensive zone. He gets a ton of minutes. He's the highest minute munching player for the defenseman player in general as well for the San Jose Sharks. And so it's difficult for him to maintain a consistent level in the defensive zone. It feels as though while he has a lot of good shifts, there are a couple of times where you're thinking like, well, what is Ferraro doing in that situation? For instance, it was, I believe in the early parts of the third period, he gets this puck and then along the corner, he just makes a very weak play up the boards, which just ends up being a straight giveaway to Detroit, who then continues to forecheck and pressure him and the players on the ice. So he has this tendency to have these really bad defensive zone shifts where he just makes the incorrect call. But as I've been saying for the entirety of this season, he's been generally okay for the Sharks this year, at least compared to the expectations of what he had been previously the past couple of seasons. So I guess it's not too bad, though the offensive issues definitely do continue for him. I also recall a play in this one where he weaves his way through the defensive zone, gets around 2 or even 3 Detroit players entering the offensive zone, gets to the corner, and then sort of plays the puck into the corner, makes nothing happen, and then gives the puck away as well. So issues defensively, issues offensively for sure, but generally an okay player for the Sharks. When it comes to Kyle Burrows, some bad plays, some good plays, trapped in the defensive zone a lot thanks to the fact that he is playing with Mario Ferraro. Whoever is going to be pairing with Mario Ferraro is likely going to be playing against top competition. So the fact that Burrows wasn't exposed as much as you might think is, I guess, a positive. When it comes to the second pairing, likely the most interesting one to talk about here tonight, we have Addison and Vlasic. Now, Addison was benched near the end of last game. We saw him not get opportunities in the 6-on-5 situation against the Islanders and not get any shifts in the overtime against that team either because he was not playing a particularly good game. Did Addison redeem himself here tonight? Sort of. While I thought he was a bit better offensively, did get involved a bit more. From a defensive standpoint, it was not a very good game for Addison. He had some issues on a lot of the goals scored here for the Detroit Red Wings, especially those first 4, not on each single one of them. But we saw, for instance, on, I believe it was the 3rd Detroit Red Wings goal, he's just not a big enough, not a strong enough player in front of the net to out-muscle Rasmussen, who I think is like 6'6", and so he easily loses that battle, and Rasmussen is able to get his stick on the puck to tip it in, and that made it 3-0. We saw Addison have some issues defending the rush on the Detroit Red Wings' 5th goal. That was the Larkin one that put them ahead in the 3rd period. And just generally, there were a few too many holes in his defensive game here tonight. When it comes to Vlasic, it's actually quite similar. Defensively, I wasn't super impressed with Vlasic, but from an offensive standpoint, Vlasic is actually contributing pretty well. Obviously, that one assist that he had on the first Nico Sturm goal right out of the box that made it 4-3 for the Red Wings was a nice one, but he was jumping up more often than not in this situation, which is even more surprising considering he is playing with Addison, who is supposed to be the most offensively inclined Sharks defenseman on this team. So you would think Vlasic would be even more incentivized to sort of sit back and just play defensively, but he's been jumping up, he's been making plays happen, and so while the defensive game was not necessarily there, Vlasic was not all that terrible. And then when it comes to this final pairing, we have Okhotyuk and Ruda. Okhotyuk, after I thought he had a strong outing against the Islanders, definitely a couple of steps back here tonight, not nearly as bad as he had been previous to that Islanders game where there was just terrible giveaway after terrible giveaway, but Okhotyuk seemed a bit slow in his own zone this one. When it comes to Ruda, I actually was relatively happy with how Ruda performed in this game, made a couple of nice plays on the penalty kill that led to those couple of shorthanded goals, and just generally was solid enough for the Sharks. And then when we have the goaltending, it was Blackwood who was in for the first 4 goals against from the Red Wings, got pulled, Kähkönen stepped in and ends up getting credited for the victory here tonight with the San Jose Sharks. I can't really blame Blackwood for most of these. The Rasmussen 2 goals were tip goals, so didn't really have much of a chance on those. Didn't have much of a chance on the 4th goal either. So it felt as though it was more so the Sharks kind of giving up in front of him and not really getting him any sort of defensive support. So a tough one for Blackwood, who ended up getting pulled. Once Kähkönen steps in, the Sharks settled things down. They managed to come back in the game. Kähkönen didn't have to face off against a ton of great opportunities, but he made a few good saves. And the one goal that he did let in, which was from Dylan Larkin, it's one that you could say, well, there's no traffic in front. He probably could have made that save, but this was an absolutely absurd shot from Larkin. It felt as though like that one was just absolutely penciled to be a goal, and so I'm not going to blame Kähkönen that much. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, where they will face off against the Vegas Golden Knights for the 6th and final game of this extremely successful road trip thus far. This is going to be perhaps the Sharks' toughest matchup of the entire road trip. The Vegas are a rival of the Sharks, and we shall see if they can defeat the defending Stanley Cup champion with all this goal support that they are currently getting. Class dismissed.